Hello, my name is Vayu Tiger. Welcome to Magic Occult Radio. And we have the guest here, Chris Lyon. How's it going, Chris?
I'm good. All right, I'm good.
Awesome. Yeah, so today we are going to be talking about hermeticism or hermetism, depending on how people use the word. I use it very distinctly. I see hermeticism later and hermetism as the early stuff, but
Mhm.
we're also going to be going into celestial ascent, which is a very important Hellenistic thought that eventually made its way over 2,000 years into what we have now, what we're going to be talking about. So, before we start into celestial ascent, there's a few things that I really want to go into and the foundation and assumptions we can make about planetary ascent, right? Or celestial ascent. One, there's always going to be a mystery. That's the
Mhm.
whole thing about this. There, you have to believe in the mysteries for this, right? So we have these general three mysteries of what we would call metempsychosis: the mysteries of life, the mysteries of death, and the mysteries of reincarnation. And the goal is to break that cycle, pretty much, according to some philosophies. So when we look at metempsychosis, what's really important here is to focus on the soul, and there's a belief in that the soul, the core essence, in which the Greeks would say the soul is in your mind, right? That it's the one that perceives everything. So, and the soul has its own nature that it's inclined to, and not only that, but the soul is tied to natural law and order, which is very important. So when we talk about natural law and order, we're talking about the cosmos being a living thing that can teach us stuff. It's not just there as empty space as we would see it today. And it's like the medium between us and creator. And also, another thing that the initiate would learn is the natural laws and how to ascend beyond some of these animal inhibitions and and to learn to work within the natural world to go up to that point. So there's a few things we also have to touch upon is that the initiate and ascension would face numerous and difficult works to reach their initiations through the spiritual ascent. They would ultimately learn to work with like I said, natural laws and the natural order. So when we say things like the universe, we're not talking about that as a separate law or something just strictly just so divine above nature. Because when we say nature, we're talking about a universal spirit in this context. Uh, Two, we apply the disciplines that they learned to master this world based on these virtues they offer. And the third is they undergo a mystical working of vision and dreams and works to access the mysteries a lot of times. This is a part of the disciplines, practices, and there's so much more involved as well with the initiations and maybe some stuff you apply in your life. And four, sometimes these inducements were assisted by wine or hallucinatory drugs. So it wasn't seen as just say, "Hey, man, let's get high." They would legitimately
There's a
use
purpose
these.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah, they would legitimately like use this stuff for spiritual reasons. And five, uh, they would live a better life, a virtuous life, so that there would be a chance they wouldn't have to be reincarnated again, that all the lessons would be over. And we like to think of Buddhism when we think of this, but Plato talks about this idea of reincarnation, and it's actually very close to a lot of Eastern concepts. And then we have number six. These maxims were taught through creeds and mythologies, and you would participate in these creeds, lessons, and mythologies to become a part of the mysteries. And the last one was that we had these meditative tools, such as how a Catholic would focus on the rosary to focus on the Christian mysteries. I'm not saying Greeks had rosaries, but they had these other methods to contemplate outwardly, but to also a meditation to look inwards with these mysteries and kind of experience them. But keep in mind, this is a very crude list with the goals of ascension. And I want to end this with with phaedo. Phaedo is one of my favorite Platonic texts, and this comes from phaedo 64a. The aim of one who's practice the aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice dying for death. And that really sums it up beautifully, this whole list and everything. Is there anything you add? Do you like the list? What would you say?
No, I think you're covering it pretty well, and we can get into I guess we can get into unpacking a lot of this. The Phaedo quote there is really interesting. It reminds me quite heavily of Macrobius's commentary on Scipio's dream, because he kind of has a similar idea where, or the basic idea that Scipio kind of gets told in his dream, right, is that we kind of have things the wrong way around. That what we consider birth is actually death of the soul, right? It's the loss of the soul's freedom. It's the loss of the soul's noetic ability. So what we consider birth is the death of the soul, and what we consider death is actually the birth of the soul and the ascension of the soul. So in that way, when they say philosophy is about preparing or dying for death, right? It's preparing for death. It's the process. I guess it's, I don't know what's the way of explaining it. The connection, I guess, well, the cyclical connection between birth and death is far more convoluted and far more complex, or arguably far more simple, depending on how you look at it, than we really understand or give credit for.
Hmm.
And this is something that we can get into with Macrobius's commentary. But I really like the idea that we kind of have things the wrong way around, essentially, which is really fun.
Yeah, and really, I think that list that I made, because I made that on contemplation on what is this about? Because so many times we like to talk about a subject, but we don't like to really contemplate on what the aim was. And when we look at this idea of planetary ascent as a standard practice in some Hellenistic cults that may, especially some of the ones that made their way into Rome, these were, especially in Hermetism, Gnosticism. When we look into some of these religions at the time, these are what tied the mysteries together, because we aren't disconnected from the universe like we like to think we are today.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, and this brings me to a point, and you've seen me post about it. It's to where when we look at an astrology chart, it's like, oh, what's my natal chart say here, right? Oh, well,
Right.
it says my sun is here, my Jupiter is here in Sagittarius, my Saturn is in Aquarius, and we have the square and everything. Or they just go off the sun sign. I'm a Libra. I'm about balance. I like to make friends. Uh, or the Sagittarius. I like to explore. I like to go out and be wild and have fun. I like to take a bite, but it's deeper than that, right? So I won't explain the whole chart, but when we take a step back and look at astrology as a form, as a different perception of astronomy, it's entirely different. So in the East, you start your first house at sunrise, and that's always going to be your first house, right? And then
Hmm.
towards the west, where the sun goes down, the western horizon, that is always going to be the boundary between the seventh and the sixth. So, a little test. If you haven't done this yet, I encourage you to kind of uh, something to contemplate on when you're looking at the mysteries in the sky is to, when you know a planet is in the ecliptic, look at where the planet is, especially at night, and then look at where that is in comparison to the western horizon, and dig out your astrology app.
Hmm.
Look at it in position, and you could guess the sign, you could guess the house, and everything else. It's really wild, and it shows that where the idea of where the ancients get this idea that the universe was living, that it was cyclical, that we are connected to it. Because when we look beyond birth charts and predictions with astrology, and we look at the movements of the planets, it's something that even goes back to Plato. Plato said that he theorizes that you had the seven wandering planets that were the gods, and that's where he believed that the Greeks got their original religion, and then they tacked on more gods and advanced it.
Hmm.
And this is Plato. It really blew me out of the water, but when we see the universe as living things, and even everything around us, like we talked about in the first episode with nature around us, where these higher forces permeate in certain ways and show themselves, manifest themselves from the invisible to the visible. Uh, like in the other video we did with the Theophanies, we have a totally different view of the mysteries. We have a totally different way to immerse, and this is how these mystery groups saw it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I, for me, I think Iamblichus and Proclus really are sort of my two main sources when I'm talking about this kind of thing. Iamblichus really kind of sets the stage for it, and then Proclus is on the hieratic art is an absolutely just beautiful, incredible text that just is kind of like the exegesis of this entire thing. But the basic core idea, and this is, I suppose, in the context of Planetary Ascent as well, the core idea I think to grasp is this idea that Iamblichus attributes to the Egyptians, and to a certain extent, I can see Egyptian parallels in my own research with it. That what Plato identifies as kind of the noetic substance, the noetic self, or kind of the divine mind, or the divine in general, is present immaterially in all material things, and they're not. It's not bound by, because the word for it's kind of a problem, because the Greek understanding of matter and physical substance changes over Greek philosophy, over the standard Greek philosophy, right? If we, even the Greek idea of the soul changes, right? So we're talking here about transmigration and things. Plato is really the first to make the distinction, I guess we can say, between material and immaterial, right? Somata asomaton, because he creates this entire philosophical language that changes Greek vocabulary, or it introduces concepts in Greek vocabulary that enable the discussion of material and immaterial things. Before Plato, if you look at the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus is a great example. They were under the impression that the soul is a material substance of some kind, right? Heraclitus, especially, he is under the impression that the soul is kind of a spark of the luminous fire, right? The central fire of the solar system, right? So also not necessarily the sun, but kind of the central fire at the heart of the universe. He's under the impression essentially that the soul is a kind of a physical fire. It's translucent and see-through, the same kind of way that Patroclus and Achilles appear in the Iliad and the Odyssey when they die. But it's still a material thing, right? Post Plato, or Plato onwards, he creates this distinction between bodied and non-bodied, right? So somaton and asomaton, or what we would call material and immaterial. And that the introduction of that distinction in the axial age, essentially, is really radical. It's huge, because it gives us this huge new space to, and a whole new vocabulary to sort of bridge out this whole idea of I guess, what we can almost call it like planetary psychology or spiritual psychology, about talking about how immaterial things, the realm of forms and the noetic reality, can affect a material. But by the time we get to the late Platonists like Iamblichus and Proclus, and I'm not a huge fan of Neoplatonists, because nobody in like Proclus, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, they do not identify themselves as Neoplatonists. They thought,
yeah, they just call themselves Platonists,
right? So I'm much more in favor of the term late Platonism. But when you get to the late Platonists, Iamblichus as the core example, he is adamantly sort of believing this idea that the gods, and that is both to a certain extent the sort of the lower material gods, so the sublunary gods, and the higher gods, in a lesser capacity but still present, they are immaterially present in all of matter, right? And this is one of the foundational things or aspects about theurgy that people often overlook, I think, because there's really two aspects of theurgy. There's theologia and theurgia. So theologia is divine speech, right? So it is speaking of divine things, and there's also theosophia, right? So divine philosophy as well, which is where we eventually have the word theosophy. But theologia is the speech of the divine, right? So it's speaking divine things into existence. And then there is theurgia, which is the ritual act. It's the the chants, it's the subvenamata, it's the arrangement of materials, it's this kind of thing, it's the incantations, the divine names. All of these things, they make up the ergon, right? The work, divine work that is performed by the theurgist, essentially. But the core idea in theurgy, essentially, I don't know, when I say theurgy, I mean specifically the Iamblican and the Proclam theurgy, as it's talked about in De Mysteres and on the Heretic Art or on the Priestly Art by Proclus. There is this idea that because the chain of being exists in every single thing and connects every single thing, you are not so much bringing gods into things, because the god and the divine presence is already there. You are purifying the substance and the material thing to match the divine resonance within it, to awaken the divine within it. And in doing so, by doing those acts, you also purify yourself as a vessel for divinity. And then in Iamblichus's concept, the theurgists purifies themselves with the intention of undergoing what is essentially divine possession. And when the divine sort of helps you and then possesses you, essentially, it heals the soul, in a manner of speaking, and gives it enough kind of extra power and noetic consciousness, and sort of stretches it back into shape. And we'll get to that in a bit. There is a specific shape that they believe the soul was. And the divine possesses us and sort of like moves us back into shape and gives us the necessary power to then reascend. But that is done through the arrangement of certain materials. And also, you'll see, as you mentioned earlier, Iamblichus mentions certain substances and potions and drinks that are drunk as part of ritual, probably that were psychedelic or entheogenic in some capacity, but he never mentions what the ingredients are, so we don't know. But they were probably in some capacity psychedelic, or in the very least narcotic. So they were brain altering in some capacity. Because what we're talking about here is an altered state of consciousness, ultimately, right? So when you're engaging with gods, and you are engaging with these kinds of works, essentially, you are engaging in an altered state of knowledge, or you are altering your consciousness, and in doing so, you are gaining a different kind of knowledge, which they identified as gnosis, different than your everyday consciousness. If I was to loop in the hermeticists for a moment here, a practicing hermetist, let's say from sort of the 1st to the 4th century AD or CE, depending on how religious you are, they would not be a fan, or they would not believe the modern kind of assumption that we have, that only this current kind of sober consciousness can be relied on for true knowledge, right? Because we have so many perceptive visors and biases in front of our sober consciousness, that the assumption, or and I would actually argue the radical assumption, that only, or even more so, the arrogance to a certain extent, that the kind of consciousness we have in day-to-day living is the only kind of consciousness that can be relied on for gaining true knowledge, is an assumption that a hermetist would not have had. They would have completely laughed you out the door for that assumption. Because this everyday waking consciousness that we have is, in their view, so heavily diluted and so heavily stretched and falsified and filled with imagery and imagination, that it cannot be relied on for anything true. The logos here is the only way for us to perceive the true noetic reality. But I think part of the issue is we do not have, we translate knowing, and the way we translate and understand knowledge, and the word knowing is a large part of the issue that we have with this whole stuff, because we translate gnosis as knowledge, and it's the worst translation that we can do, because it's not knowledge. The way, like, conventionally, sure, you can literally translate it like word to word. It means knowledge, and that grasps some measure of the concept. But English, as a language, does not have a word for the kind of knowledge and knowing that they are talking about in this context. German, I think German and Dutch does. It's kind of a knowledge, like, there's a word that means like a knowledge through direct experiential revelation. It's like a word for knowing by being beside and absorbing.
Yeah,
It's not knowing in the sense of reading a textbook and learning this stuff. It's a lived experience of knowing, and we don't have a word for that in English. Hanegraaff, so Walter Hanegraaff in his new Hermetic book, he's argued that we introduced the verb noeticizing, so using our nous to understand something as opposed to using knowledge instead. So he'd say, yes, I know something, but you can also say, yes, I noeticize something.
yeah.
Sense of you understand it experientially with your nous, right? Which I think is a very interesting kind of new idea that I think we should run with. But I'm getting ahead of
Yeah.
myself. So back to
Well,
you.
you're right. You're right. The type of knowing that we're talking about kind of goes back to a dialogue that Plato wrote
Mm,
when he was when Socrates was in prison, and he's discussing stuff with his friends, and he has a very interesting conversation on the soul.
mm,
Probably one of the most important Platonic works and discussions on the soul. But he says something very intriguing, that the soul has memory and that you can bring back past memories of the soul in this life.
right.
And really, this stems from Pythagoreanism.
Mm,
So, Pythagoreanism, they had the same idea of metempsychosis. I think it's Iamblichus in the life of Pythagoras writes somewhere along the lines that Pythagoras could recall his past lives,
yeah.
that were reincarnated over and over. And that's overall what we're talking about is this idea of metempsychosis in this order of the universe, in this order of nature with everything around us. And let's draw this back to Pythagoreanism, because I don't want to say this is where it starts, but this is definitely where a lot of the ideas solidify.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's believed that Pythagoras was a part of the Orphic cult, and he wrote some of the Orphic hymns back in his day. And it's believed that the Orphics were an offshoot of Bacchus. So,
Yeah. The Orphism is largely believed to have been an ascetic offshoot of the Dionysian mysteries. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, uh, we don't know that much about Orphism, really.
No,
We,
not in
we
comparison to other mystery cults. Well, to the extent that we know anything about the mystery cults, we know them. We know the smallest amount about the Orphics. Yeah, because like one of their only texts, really, or the earliest text, is the Deveni Papyrus, and it's
Yeah,
so
and it dates
incredibly
back to
fragmented.
Plato.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fragmented. It is like so weirdly confusing that like we have it, but
And
no one really knows what it says.
and what we have, I mean, it's closer to Hesiod and his
Yeah.
theogony than anything, you
Mm.
know? I mean, so what I find interesting about these mysteries, when we look into Pythagoras, this is where we really find the core to a lot of Plato's works.
Yeah.
And before we deemed Plato as this big hero, we could say that Pythagoras was this hero that everybody leaned on. Like,
Yeah,
who
I
could
would say
not?
probably Pythagoras was probably Plato's hero, in the same way that Plato or Aristotle is our hero today. When we think
Mhm.
about it, Pythagoras was probably his hero. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we look at Pythagoras, it's so interesting. His mystery cult was so wild because
Mm.
rather than going through these initiations like the Orphics did, it this is why I kind of tend to separate the schools a little bit. Like you had your mystery schools that are more based on the mythologies and more based on the direct correspondence with the gods. And
Mm.
then Pythagoras kind of broke off from that and said, wait, let's take the approach of taking mathematics, taking science, and analyzing this on a rational nature through geometry, through music, even further. And a lot of people think today's tuning is Pythagorean tuning when it's really not. It's actually a really cool microtone tuning. Is that
Mm.
what it's called?
Yeah.
Microtonal tuning, right? So it's actually really cool when you actually listen to the real Pythagorean tuning. So this draws me to the point of music and math, and
Mm.
this is where we can draw on everything else. Is that we don't know much about Pythagoras. We don't know if even if he came up with these concepts. We don't know what some of these early Pythagoreans believed. We just have later stuff. So I'm going to go on the assumption at least that they did this, and I'm not saying it's factual, but it's just a part of that tradition. So one thing that I find is that number was the backing to everything, right?
Mm.
Everything's made a number. Me, you, my cat on my lap. the planets, and then we had the music of the spheres, even the elements. And one thing I find really wild is Pythagoras placed more emphasis on the elements, on the four elements, than what we see with later Renaissance writers, which placed them as sublunary, right? So I could see where Agrippa took that elementary quality from Pythagoras and place elementary quality like throughout all of creation, not just the sublunary manifestation. So what's really cool is when I look into stuff like Pythagoras, he had this idea of sickness, right? That whenever you got sick, that the elements inside of you were not in tune or uh, with the tune of the universe, and it caused you to become ill.
Mm.
So this is where we kind of see the philosophical mysteries really that we're talking about, to where it was written, I think, by Iamblichus or Philolaus, one of them, that he, while his initiates would be sleeping, he would play music while they're sleeping at different paces. He would play it slower, play it faster, different modes and everything. And then they would wake up and they would have these mystical experiences. This is directly tied to the mysteries of ascent.
Yeah.
And with the way that he places these mysteries, not just on music, but just understanding number. He saw how the government was ran by fractions, in a way as being in tune, in sync with the universe. Right. That's how he established his ideal government, according to Iamblichus, and everything was structured in that particular way to cause harmony in a very interesting way. Like, you would be in tune with the planets, you would be in tune with the demigods up above the celestial plane. And we see it in the Pythagorean golden verses as well, is that once you achieve this certain state of gnosis, although he probably didn't use the word gnosis, but I'll use it.
Yeah, sure.
But once you achieve this certain state of mysteries with number, with understanding the divine nature of number, and understanding how your soul is actually a participant, not an observer, but a real participant in this universal world and in divinity, he even tells us that we go back to divinity in the end, that the soul is immortal, that it can't die, which is really the basic foundations of where we get the later Greek mysteries post Pythagoras, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Pythagorean cult, for the most part, especially his school in Italy, they are largely famous for the Greek phrase, the phrase physis et rhythmos, which is nature is number, right? And like that's essentially the complete core of their philosophy, that everything in nature can be eventually distilled back to the monad, and the monad is an individual oneness, essentially. And the the thing with it, which is always really interesting to me, you mentioned him playing him playing music at different places where people slept. The Greek astronomer Ptolemy references a similar idea, where he says one of the first, as part of their morning routine, right, the Pythagoreans, one of the first things they would do upon waking up in the morning was play the lyre in Pythagorean tuning, right? And like the reason they did it was to align the soul to the planetary spheres, because there was, as you were saying, there was this overarching assumption in the music of the spheres, and that you had to be aligned to the universal music, because there's the musica harmonia, which is kind of, or the musica universalis, which is the universal music, but there's also the musica mondana, which is the human music as well. So there is a human resonance, essentially, that corresponds to the universal music, and that human resonance has to be aligned to the universal music in order for things to flow naturally. Essentially, the resonance exists, right? And Plato uses a similar idea. There are, especially in the Timaeus, which is there's so much Pythagoreanism in the Timaeus.
Mhm.
The whole section where he starts talking about when the demiurge crafts the soul. Pretty much all. In fact, I would even argue the majority, if not all, of Plato's understanding of the soul is Pythagorean, essentially. Right, the
Certainly.
entire section where he's talking about the demiurge crafting the soul in different ratios and proportions and that kind of thing, he's Pythagorizing the hell out of it, right? Like he's drawing on so much Pythagoras there, where he's talking about the ratios and the fractions and all that kind of thing. So there was clearly an interchange going on, and people, I think people misunderstand the influence of Pythagoras far too much. Or they underestimate the influence that Pythagoras had, I think, hugely. And it's a real issue, right? And Pythagoras, he's had his fair share of weird stuff attached to him.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
But that kind of comes to the territory, being a weird mystery cult leader, for essential thing. And it's also interesting to me that even throughout the medieval period, when we're getting commentaries and things on Pythagoras, it's actually rare for them to say it's a mystery religion or a mystery cult. The term most often used is the Pythagorean Brotherhood rather than Pythagorean Mystery School, which is interesting. So because it implies there are mysteries, evidently, or what we would identify as mysteries, but it doesn't seem, as far as I can tell, that the Pythagoreans ever identified themselves as mystery initiates. So they saw themselves as doing something a bit different, And it's also interesting to me, and this is where things get a bit fascinating for me, because we largely, even in modern physics, right, we still use Pythagoras' worldview, right? This whole idea in modern physics and modern mathematics that mathematics is the language of the universe is an infinitely small step away from mathematics is the universe, right? That the universe itself is number. We essentially just added in an extra word to say, oh, well, the universe can be described by number. It's no different, really. If you're saying, okay, well, the universe we can describe it in terms of mathematics and numbers, that number and mathematics is an inherent thing in the universe. That's pretty much word for word what Pythagoras is saying, 2,000 years ago, which is amazing. When you think of it, and this idea isn't lost on people. So people like Werner Heisenberg, right? So one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, he is largely famous for saying that a large amount of modern quantum mechanic theory or quantum mechanical theory is essentially just confirming Pythagorean doctrine about the universe. So it's an interesting idea that this way of thinking, or this I don't know, this philosophy, I guess, of looking at the world, it's still going on. This is not something that is some kind of archaic relic or some kind of superstition that existed 2,000 years ago that we've now just forgotten and advanced away from. In a way, number describes all of the mechanistic principles. So, and it's one of the funny things when you deal with sort of the atheistic materialist models, and they say, oh, well, no, the universe is entirely mechanical, and they'll then quote numbers to you. It's like, okay, well, what do you think a number is? Right?
It's like the ancient aliens meme. It's like, I'm not saying it's number, but it's number.
But it's number, yeah. It's not number. It's not divine. It's part of this whole interesting discussion. Since with the secularization and people running away from religion so much. If you look at the way Plato describes the soul, right? So the word Plato uses for soul usually is psyche, right? So psyche. It's where we get the word psychology or psyche today. The way Plato describes the soul is, for all intents and purposes, like the organ of perception, right? The bounded inner self, essentially. And what's really interesting about the whole thing is if you look at how a modern cognitive scientist describes consciousness or describes the mind, it's basically word for word the way Plato describes the soul, right? Yeah. But modern neuroscientists and modern biologists, they don't want to use the word soul because it's too spiritual and too religious. And they're like, oh, no, we've moved away from religion now. We don't talk about that. Religion has no place in science, which is kind of the typical atheistic model. But the way Plato describes the soul is essentially almost identical to the way a modern cognitive scientist describes the mind. And in fact, Plato argues that the soul is essentially the higher, or rather the mind is, or what he calls the mind, right? Or nous, essentially, so reason, is the higher processing faculty of the soul. So all of the awareness, the collective awareness itself, the organ of the bounded inner self, the organ of perception is the soul, essentially. And it's, that in itself, there is like a kind of another mystery in that whole thing itself. But Plato gets a lot of those ideas from Pythagoras, essentially. and Pythagoras conceptualized a lot of it in terms of number, as you said, right? And to a certain extent, I would argue, I think, that Plato's perfect idealism can also be found in Pythagoras as well.
Oh,
Plato
without a doubt.
Plato is ultimately perfect idealism.
Especially with Neo-Pythagoreans, yeah.
Absolutely. So Iamblichus was a prime example of it as well. But Plato's idea with the monad is you have kind of talpon and phaedo and ousia, which is sameness, otherness, and essence or being, essentially. And the essence or being, the ousia, it results from sameness and otherness coming together. And then it's the unified experience of singleness and otherness, right? Or sameness and otherness, essentially. He talks about it a lot in the Timaeus. But this whole idea, which is really interesting with it, is the monad, essentially, it's self-actualizing, right? So the monad actualizes and thinks itself into existence. And when it does, that progression into the dyad, so the monad becoming the dyad, is in itself the way that the monad can look back on itself. And this is all, it's something that is interpreted a little bit differently by Plotinus, but Plotinus still has the same idea, where the one is so absolutely transcendent that it almost doesn't know it exists, right? It's beyond being. It's so far out there that no word, no nothing at all can come.
And that's still a Muslim idea, and we still find that in a lot of Christian mystics.
Yeah, right. So and it doesn't surprise me that it's found in Muslim either, because a lot of the early Islamic philosophy was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism as well. But the basic idea is, for Plotinus, and he's interpreting this aspect of Plato's Timaeus kind of metaphorically and via imagery, the basic idea is that the one is so perfect, it's so absolute and removed that it almost doesn't know it exists, because existence doesn't exist for the one. It exists outside of existence. So in order for the one to self-actualize, it has to create a dyad of itself that can kind of reflect, and as the dyad kind of comes out of the one, which is kind of what the role of the demiurge serves, right? It kind of looks back on the one and looks back up at it. And then by it's self-perceiving, And the idea essentially is, and people like Erwin Schrödinger in the early quantum mechanics days back in the 20s picked up on this. It's that the number of minds in the universe is one. Right, so there is the world soul, and then when you look a little bit deeper into it, when you look at how Plato describes the world soul and how he describes our individual consciousness being cut from the same fabric or the same cloth, the world soul existing inside the world soul, he kind of conceptualizes it as there is only one nous in all of existence. That nous is the ultimate ontological reality, right? That there is nous is the only truth, and this is the thing we find in the Hermetica too, where it's this is one of the issues that I think people generalize too much, where they will use, people will often try to translate the word nous the same in every text, in every scenario, in every context, when it's a real issue, because nous does not mean the same thing in different contexts, right? The nous to Plato, to Aristotle, and to a hermetist do not mean the same thing. Right? Aristotle seemed to use it in the sense of an organ of perception, right? So it's kind of close to what we would say consciousness is. So it's kind of like a sense perception, essentially, in the sense of reason. Plato uses it in the sense of divine reason, essentially. But the way Plato uses it is as kind of a single unified mind. Yes, we have a mind, but our nous is a part of the world soul, and the world soul's nous, and the world soul's nous is the demiurge itself. The demiurge is essentially synonymous with the divine nous, essentially.
And you bring up a very important point that a lot of people overlook. A lot of the Greeks shared the same language, but had different definitions for the same words.
Yes,
like the monad, the pre-Socratics had a different view of the monad. I mean, I think the monad became a little more solidified right after Plotinus. I think it became a little more universalized and shared.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the monad didn't mean the same thing. Nous didn't mean the same thing. We could say that the word for soul didn't mean the same thing.
Right.
And philosophers argued over this. If you go through Plato's dialogues, you'll see like stuff like man is the measure of all things from Anaxagoras.
Hmm.
And then I love Socrates' response to it. He goes, I was delighted when he said man is the measure of all things, but I was very disappointed when he didn't say pig and baboon and the and is the measure of all thing because they also have perception.
Yeah.
So they used the same phrases, but they interpreted all of it so differently. So you couldn't look at a Pythagorean word for nous and equate like the Pythagorean monad, for example, to the uh, Platonic monad.
No.
You
Not at
know,
all. Yeah.
uh, you just couldn't do it, and this is
No.
the issue:
Absolutely
is
not.
with language.
Right, and it's how concepts get translated over. The example I often like to use with it is take someone like Deepak Chopra, right? So in the New Age community, in the 80s when he was writing his first books, he is largely credited with the popularization of the word quantum healing, right? That's
Mhm.
used in all the kind of the modern New Agey books about self-help and self-healing and mind cure stuff that's derived from New Thought. Um, Deepak Chopra, like I like to kind of use the example of like imagine, somebody like a literary analyst 200 years in the
Mhm.
future looking back at the literature of our time, right? And they look at someone like Deepak Chopra and they see that he's using this word quantum and he's using a lot of concepts from quantum mechanics, right? So he's using superposition, he's using entanglement, he's using the word quantum itself, he's using all these different things, right? And in his work, they all mean something entirely different to how a quantum physicist would use the words, right? They're not all the
Mhm.
same. How a quantum physicist uses the word entanglement and superposition is in no way the same as how Deepak Chopra uses it in his quantum mysticism,
Mhm.
right? They're not all the same. But if we were to try and apply this logic and be like, oh, well, hold on, he's using the same word, so it must mean the same thing, you're arguing
Yeah.
that Deepak Chopra is a quantum physicist, that he has an understanding of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't make sense, right? So no, we have to look at words in the context of how the authors themselves are defining them. And the
Mhm.
biggest example for this is if we were to look at Hermetica, for example, nous is used entirely differently to Pythagorean and Platonic uh, ideas in Hermetica. Uh, nous for the Hermetica, especially in Corpus Hermeticum 1, especially, so the Poimandres, it has two definitions. So the first real definition of nous for a hermeticist or a hermetist is that nous is the ultimate reality in and of
Yeah.
itself. So the monad and nous are kind of the same thing, right?
Mhm.
You have sort of the levels of being essentially that go up through the planetary spheres, and then you have the older world and the Ennead, so the eighth and the ninth, which is in the Nag Hammadi library as well. We have the discourse on that. And largely, I think it's probably the Ennead, so the ninth sphere, is nous itself. That nous
Mhm.
it has an ontological definition in that it is actually a layer of being, right? That nous is kind of synonymous with life and light. When it says God is life and light, the life and light of
Mhm.
the Father of God is nous, right? It is mind and a light is the ultimate reality, that there is nothing else. All of these imageries, all of these forms that we see in the physical world, they are shadows and appearances that exist on top of nous, essentially.
Mhm.
So that's the first thing to understand. The way a hermetist uses nous is ontologically, first and foremost, as the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
It's a level of being, right? A state of being that exists that everything else is kind of built around, essentially. But the Hermetica in Poimandres also identifies nous. I believe the exact phrasing is nous is also that in you which sees and hears as well,
Mhm.
right? Which is a quote from the Corpus Hermeticum 1. So it is also the part of us that can comprehend and gain notice of things at the same
Mhm.
time. So there is a kind of a play on words with this in the sense that nous is both the ontological reality and epistemologically, through the sense of knowing, it is the way we can apprehend and understand the
Yeah.
true reality. So the basic idea is that Nous understands itself, right? Or Nous apprehends
It's
itself.
almost like the core of gnosis in a way.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the core gnosis in and of itself is understanding that the Nous in you is the universal Nous. That there
Yeah.
is no distinction between you and the monad, or there's no distinction between you and the universal Nous,
And if
because
you like that
we are
news,
it.
like that's considered ignorance.
Yes, essentially, and
Mhm.
I would argue to that extent that ignorance is almost the cardinal hermetic sin. There's
Yeah.
been a lot of scholarship failure recently that the idea of sin or fall of man doesn't necessarily exist in Hermetica, and that's kind of a big debate that's going on at the moment.
Mhm.
Where it turns out a lot of the sections where people talk about a fall of man, or where a fall of man has been implied or translated, a lot of those are mistranslations or interpolations by Byzantine
Mhm.
scribes that didn't, maybe weren't part of the original tradition. Um,
Mhm.
so it's kind of up in the air over whether sin actually exists in Hermetica at all. But the core idea with it. There is kind of this juxtaposition between the cardinal sin, really, the thing that even the gods can't forgive, and then Iamblichus
Mhm.
also echoes this. He actually mentions it. I think it's in like book 8 of De Mysteries. Um, the cardinal sin is ignorance, or rather
Yeah.
irreverence. Actually, I think it is a better way of putting it. Uh, is the one thing that gods cannot forgive, right?
Yeah.
Being irreverent or being ignorant, or I should say, being deliberately ignorant. Maybe is a
Yeah.
better way
We
of
find
putting it.
that in an Nag Hammadi too, which isn't surprising
Right, because there
because
there are Hermetic influences on that as well. Yeah.
yeah. And so yeah, I mean, I think this is a good time because I think we laid out the good foundation of gnosis, nous,
Yeah, for
the
sure.
one, and this is really the one is the basis of what I like to call celestial ascent.
Hmm.
The goal is the one. That's it,
Right,
right?
it's
Yeah,
henosis, right?
yeah.
It's reunifying yourself with the divine, or in a well, so yeah, so it depends on the system, but for the most part, reunifying yourself with the divine. Um, the Hermetic rebirth that is mentioned in Corpus Hermeticum 13 is maybe a little bit different, only in the sense of you gain a more permanent kind of gnosis, and then are essentially born again in a new body that is unbound
Yeah.
by fate, right? So you gain gnosis of the one, but then incarnate back into a body, essentially, or the nous.
Yeah.
It's not entirely clear what actually ascends in Hermetica. That's another thing we can talk about, ascends and descends. But the idea is, especially if you after you've undergone purification. So the basic idea is that you go through practices in the way of Hermes, and you may gain a beatific vision. So you may gain a vision of the good, but because of our
Hmm.
incarnated state, where the body itself is not the problem, the harmful
Yeah.
passions that plague
Yeah.
the body are the problem. The body itself is also divine. If we read the Asclepius,
Yeah.
it's very, very adamant, very, very clear that human beings are described as a third god. That our body, that we are
Hmm.
in a state, and Pico actually captures this really, really well in his oration. Um, that human beings are unique and beautiful among all of God's creatures, because we are both. We are both. We have access to
Yeah.
Nous. We have access to the divine, but we also have the pleasures and the sensuality of material existence, and therefore the opportunity and the ability to bring the Nous into material existence
Hmm.
and beautify the world. Right. So in Hermetica, one of the core ideas is our responsibility as humans is to align the forms in the world
Hmm.
closer to the good. That's kind of our
Yeah.
core purpose,
And
right?
that's a lot like Plato too.
Yeah, exactly. And by as he says in I think it's Thetetius, right? The core of the philosophy begins in wonder, right? It begins
Yeah.
in reverence, essentially, and it's the same is true for Hermetica too, right? Like
Hmm.
students and people on the way of Hermes, they are taught in increasing levels of order, essentially, or increasing levels of density, that you need to be able to see the divine and the immaterial in all, in everything, and in doing
Hmm.
so, you come to knowledge of the good through
Yeah.
nature. Because nature itself and incarnation is a miraculous gift from the divine. It's not, and
Yeah.
this is one of the things where I personally fall on in the camp in Hermetic scholarship of saying that there is no fall of man, and I know that
Hmm.
it's a bit controversial. But I personally, I don't. When I read Hermetica, when I read the poem Andres, I don't see a fall of man, um,
Yeah.
because the incarnation into matter is almost divinely ordered by Poimandres. It's divinely
Yeah.
ordered by the one, right? And the one, even then, actually, when it says, go forth and multiply in the same manner of Genesis, right? That's an actual commandment from God. It's
Mhm.
not a consequence of fall or passion or whatever it is. It's an actual command
Mhm.
given by the one, essentially. So it's divinely ordained that the incarnation into matter is a gift, and that we
Mhm.
have a responsibility to wield this gift properly, essentially. But it
Mhm.
is actually a beautiful condition because we are both. We are divine in the sense
Mhm.
of we have access to our nous and we have the ability to choose that, right? And the idea, and this is kind of reference, I think, it's like Corpus Hermeticum 7, which is kind of a preachy sermon vibe. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, that nous is available to everybody, the divine, through its gracious love, it kind of makes nous available for everybody, but only those who actively choose it and cultivate it can have it.
Yeah.
You know, and the rest of you who don't will, spend your life wandering in darkness, and then eventually kind of reincarnate, transmigrate down the chain of being until, and then eventually into the soul of unreasoning animals,
Mhm.
which is the whole other thing, and that's the kind of the reverse of anabasis, which is ascend. Is there is a kind of katabasis where you descend into the underworld into more and more unreasoning forms. So, and it's very Pico as well. I love it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, let's do a segue here into like the myth of all ascension stories.
okay.
Into the myth of air in the Republic, Book
Mhm.
10. So essentially, what happens is there's this hero or this warrior. His name is Air, and he awakes on the 12th day of the pyre as they're getting ready to burn him. And he is chosen essentially by the gods to tell about his ascent, right? About the story of the afterlife. So, what's really interesting about this is he says that he sees himself above the earth. And then there's this judge, pretty much you would think of a Christian judge, a Christian version of God saying, "This is good, this is bad, you're evil." Like souls of tyrants were committed down to Tartarus, which is the place you didn't want to go, right?
Not the greatest players. Yeah.
Yeah. So then you had the souls that was more like in purgatory for 1,000 years. They did a few sins and they had to pay 100 years for each sin that they committed. And then you have this idea of those who were ready to ascend higher because they did all the right things. And this is where we get into the spindle of Plato. And the spindle of Plato is this concept of this thread, right? That goes all the way up. So think of like if I get the best way I could see it is like a bowl, right? You have a little bowl and a big bowl on the little bowl and a bigger bowl on it. So think of of a spindle, and the spindle keeps getting bigger and wider, right? And what makes this really interesting is this deals with the three fates as well. They're
Mm.
really important, and this is a part of the mystery of the past, present, and future who determines the fate of man. Now, each line of the spindle is really cool because when you look at it, you have the planets in there, and he goes a little bit into this into also the Timaeus about the planets and the orbs. He doesn't go by the Great Chain of Being order, which is really interesting.
Mm.
But regardless, uh, as you're going up this spindle, you're going up to meet one of the fates. I'm pulling up my notes here. Let me see. So yeah, you go up to meet the fates, and this is where they, in essence, they ask you somewhere along the lines, what life do you want to choose? And they allot you these different lives that
Mm.
you would pick. And she said, you don't have to pick right now. And this is where it gets really intriguing because once you pick a life, you are assigned a daimon in the myth of air. So once you're assigned that daimon, then you go into this cave, right? And then once you go into this cave, you drink from the waters of forgetfulness. So you forget that life, and then you're born into your whole other life. So we have a whole theology around this. You have your daimon, you have this idea of the soul as you're dead, going through this and through the planets, and you're dealing with past, present, and future. And then you're also dealing with this idea of learning your lessons, not to be a tyrant. You're trying to learn the lessons of what does it mean to live an honorable life, and you're also choosing your obstacles. I mean, it's funny because you'll find a lot of this in a more new age sort of way. Like, yeah, he chose this life.
Yeah,
They don't even
it's found in theosophy. Yeah,
yeah, like they don't realize where the idea really comes from
yeah,
sometimes. And it's so interesting once you do know where it comes from, because this is a part of the access of the mysteries. Like, and we can't forget you're on this earth and you're trying to understand the mysteries of each planet. And we see this in Hermetic Ascent, which we'll go through here in a little bit.
hmm.
So in this myth, it's really cool because in Scipio we have like the Roman version of this,
Hmm.
be a good citizen, be a good Roman citizen. That's which is the core of it. And each planet has its own note as well. And the same is true with the myth of air.
Hmm.
In the myth of air, like it's really cool on this spindle, like each planet has its own note. And we see this planet governed by the fates. We see that the fates that they control the movement of the spindle coming down all the way to where we are. And and this lays out a full-blown theology that we can look into and say, wow, this is actually really intense. And if we want to look at any philosophical mystery school like Pythagoras or Plato or any others, like even Hermetica, we can point to the myth of air and be like, this is possibly one of the best examples that we have surviving today to explain the mysteries to us,
Yeah,
that we can interpret, that we can use, and how we deal with the past, how we deal with the present, how we deal with the future, and how we're cut off from this life. And it's like that quote I said at the beginning, pretty much philosophy is the art of dying. And that's what the myth of air is about. That's what philosophy is about. It's about the art of dying. And we cannot forget that when we look at the planetary ascent, because if we live a good life, if we live an honorable life, a simple life, which is promoted by Plato and a lot of the Greek philosophers, and even the Stoics to a great extent, it's that same core belief that if we go through those mysteries, although I don't think the Stoics focused on ascension, but regardless, it's this idea that once we learned about this stuff, and one thing where I think the Stoics really resonated with the Platonists and with the Pythagoreans is that once you find contentment in your soul, once you found not the need for want, but the need for acceptance. Once you found peace in your soul, uh, and once you've experienced those planets, the good and the bad, and you've learned from each side of them. You learn their vices and their virtues. That once you ascend that, I mean, we can assume that the journey is a lot easier, especially once the soul loses its qualities as it goes through each planet. I know you have it somewhere around you. Can you go through the planets, planetary
in
readings of the
Hermetica,
ascent?
in
Yeah, can you
the
read that and
yes.
go
Where's
through it?
my? Here we go. Let's have a look. Let's bring this down.
Because this is a really big part of the whole
It's
thing.
a big part of the point Mandaras, at least
Yeah.
at the beginning. Yeah,
And
yeah. So go on.
oh yeah, and I want to make one more note here too. Like Plato, he also talks about the Timaeus as well. And in the Timaeus, he equates the human soul that if a human soul has been good in this life, that they become a fixed star. Like, that's
Right,
really
they
intriguing.
return to the starry heaven. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that itself is also very interesting because so when we're getting so as we're getting into this, there are a couple of points I want to make, I guess, for background purposes, which should help people understand. So first, when we mentioned the dream of Scipio, there the Roman version of it, which I think is very interesting. And to recap, 'cause I think we mentioned this at the beginning, but I think it's important to recap. One of the essential core points in Scipio's dream is this idea that actually when we talk about living and or birth and death, we actually have it backwards. that what we consider birth, so incarnation into a physical body, is in a way kind of the death of the soul, right? So the soul loses its kind of free floating, noetic, pure absolute consciousness that is unfiltered, right? So the true perception of things, we lose that when we incarnate. And then when we die, death is the birth of a soul, right? Because the soul is released and flies back up to the one, essentially. And that's a really important thing. So during the Middle Ages, there were numerous commentaries composed on Scipio's dream. One of the most famous was by Macrobius. And Macrobius, he had this very extensive commentary. It's very, very interesting. So I think before we talk about planetary ascent, it's probably a good point just to mention Macrobius's account of katabasis, which is kind of planetary descent. So what happens on the other end of it? So when we're incarnating into the body, what happens to the soul, right? So the Hermetica also describes this, but it kind of glosses over it a bit quickly, which is very interesting, where it says that when the divine logos that is man essentially incarnates into a body, it passes through the 7 planetary spheres and takes on a portion of each of their influence, right? And that influence we call himamere, which is fate, right? And that's kind of how we conceptualize it. Macrobius has this absolutely beautiful imagery where he builds on Plato's Timaeus. He says, okay, originally the noetic soul is circular, right? Because the circle in the Timaeus is the shape of God. So the most divine circle, or the most divine shape, which our soul is originally without the body. So if the soul is existing, the nous, whatever, is outside the body, its natural shape is circular, like a sphere, essentially. And what ends up happening is when it comes down into the body, it sort of comes out of the Milky Way, which is in Macrobius's medieval view was thought to be sort of the Empyrean layer, essentially, or the sphere of the fixed stars. So it was beyond the zodiac, essentially. So the soul, as this kind of sphere of noetic light, essentially, comes down out of the Milky Way, and I think he actually makes the argument that it enters through Cancer, which itself is also interesting. It's Cancerian because Cancer is kind of the womb and it's the moon as well, which makes complete sense, right? So he makes the argument that the soul enters the material or the sublunary sphere through Cancer, essentially. And when it does, it enters not only by the zodiac, right? So it takes on zodiacal influences. But what ends up happening is when it moves through the planetary spheres, each time it moves down one of the spheres, the soul basically gets squished and stretched, essentially. So it starts off as this like beautiful luminous sphere that's like shining and amazing. But what ends up happening to it when it eventually gets into the body is the soul kind of gets stretched out into a kind of like a cone. So it's conical in shape, essentially. And what ends up happening, because that is kind of a perversion of the divine form, that then opens the soul up to attack by negative passions, right? The dangerous passions, which are personified as astral daimons for the most part. So as we said in the myth of we have this recurring idea that we are assigned a daimon. We are also assigned negative daimons based on the time and location of our birth as well. So as soon as, in theory, according to Macrobius at least, when the soul initially sort of punctures the fixed star, the Empyrean layer, and comes through Cancer, as soon as it gets subject to under the zodiac, essentially, it starts getting bombarded and attacked by astral daimons. And the reason being is that as soon as we come into the sphere of the fixed stars, or as soon as we become under it, meaning we become under the influence of fate and necessity, then we essentially get spatial temporal coordinates attached to our soul, right? We come into existence, we come into, or more to the point, if I was using Greek terminology, we come out of ion, which is an ion is kind of the eternal time, right? So there's chronos and ion. So chronos is kind of the material time, the minute time. Ion is the eternal time, right? So we come out of the ion, the eternal, and we enter into the material kind of sublunary realm of generation, right? And when that happens, we come through at a specific kind of spatial temporal point. And that creates essentially a set of coordinates, so to speak. We're using modern speak, right? That basically tells the astral daimons of that particular area, the ruling face lords, the ruling deacon lords, all that kind of thing, where our soul is, and they rush us, essentially. They rush and attack us, and they then manifest in us as the harmful passions, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we get this idea of a hermetic psychology, almost, where hermetic psychology is really a psychology of addiction, and it's a psychology of passions, where Plutarch in the Moralia also talks about this. But the entire point of mindfulness exercises and things like this are designed to kind of quell and control the harmful passions, right? So we can kind of distinguish between good passions and harmful passions. The good passions for Plutarch, for example, are the thumos, it's the drive, it's the courage, right? These things are passions, but they get us to move. But there are also harmful passions, growth and decline, corruption, I don't know, greed, avarice, all these kinds of things, right? Envy is another good one. All of these harmful things, they do harm to us, but they are not necessarily the result of our soul. They are the result of our soul being attacked by astral daimons that are personifications.
And these are planetary daimons, right?
But planetary or fixed stars. So they're essentially.
So it could be both or whatever.
It could be it could be. It's not specified exactly. The Stobaean Hermetica talk about daimons of both the firmament, or everything, firmament, the fixed stars. We talk about deacon daimons or deacon lords, also assigning the deacon lords rule the astral daimons that attack you based on your natal chart, essentially. So your natal chart is kind of the coordinate system that tells you which daimons are influencing you, essentially. And that are by looking at the natal chart, we can learn to transcend the natal chart. It's kind of where the idea is. But the deacon lords kind of rule the daimons that are attacking us, essentially. And the way they attack us is rather interesting, because they essentially possess us. So it's one of those funny things where, according to Hermetic psychology, we are constantly possessed by demons all the time. Until you undergo an exorcism, essentially, or a Hermetic exorcism, and you are purified and therefore reborn, which is basically what all of Hermetica, Corpus Hermeticum 13 is. That whole section. Until that happens, you are plagued by what the Hermetica identifies in varying terms as tormentors. At one point, it calls these things the criminal that lives in your house. I think in Corpus Hermeticum 7, I think it is. It describes it very kind of vividly as being like, your body is your house or your tent, kind of like the tabernacle almost. It says that there is a hidden criminal that's living in your house that's slowly killing you, right? And it's conceptualizing the harmful passions, right? But this is a really important point to make. It's really important, because some people try to interpret this as saying that Hermetica is an ascetic movement, and they try to say that Hermetica is it's non-materialist, or it's a dualistic faith. I do not read any dualism in Hermetica. I think it's monoistic, if anything.
Well, it seems more in line with Pythagoras or Plato, to where they saw like all these movements. For example, let's take our understanding. You would have Mars and Venus. They would seem totally contradictory, right? But like the notes, once you get to the Ennead, it all creates a perfect harmony with all of it together, like Plato describes. It all eventually harmonizes the closer you are to the one.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of what we were touching on earlier. The monad self-actualizes itself, right? The monad itself is a Pythagorean term, right? Pythagoras is really the one that coins the term, even though it's talked about in different contexts. But when we talk about it, when you zoom out, like you're saying, and you look at it, you kind of have this understanding that the monad is creating all these movements. It's creating the dyad, essentially, right? So even though from our perspective down here, when we look up and we look at the world, it seems dualistic, right?
And it seems chaotic. It seems
crazy. It seems all these things, right? When you actually look at it from the perspective of the monad, even though there is this separation between, there's a planet over here that's doing this motion, another one over here doing this motion, actually, those planets what's the way of putting it? It's really hard to put into words, right? They need each other to define where each other is.
Oh
right?
yeah, and the best way to describe this, and I think you'd agree, is through music. You
Mm,
know, like if you have a guitar and your guitar is in tune,
yeah.
right? That all the strings make a different note. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And a lot of times they won't fully harmonize. But once you put different chords together, different notes together, different scales together, once you start to learn how different modes work together, it starts to create this beautiful harmony. So
yeah.
it's not the strings that they could be perfectly tuned,
Yeah.
but they may not sound great together. But once you play them right, and once you start playing and know how they're played, then it all makes sense. Then you could put together a beautiful song, a beautiful piece. And this is also how the universe works and
Mm,
how philosophy works. Philosophy is like that musician learning the music of the skies,
yeah.
learning how they all work together as he chases the virtues.
Right. And then you realize, or the basic idea is that you realize then all the notes are actually on the same guitar,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's all on the fretboard essentially, right? And that, like, even if you're playing 12th fret on the E string, or you're just playing
Mhm.
zero on the E string, it's the same note, right?
Yeah,
It's the same
it's just
sequence
an
of
octave
events.
up.
Right, exactly. Right. And we can't perceive that octave from down here, essentially. That's kind of where we're going with it. Um,
Yeah,
but looping back around here, so coming back to coming back to Hermetica real quickly. Um, the kind of the assumption with this essentially, it is a very, like I said, people kind of take this to view the Hermetica as a kind of an ascetic text, or an ascetic movement that is very against the body, or very against materiality. And they say, there are sections and things in Corpus Hermeticum 1 or whatever to say, like, or it says, like, to love the body is evil, or the love or whatever is the cause of death and desire, or whatever, anything like that. That's grossly been overemphasized, in my opinion. But strictly speaking, the body itself is not evil. So
yeah.
incarnation is not evil. It's the passions that are the problem, right? It's the harmful passions. And the way Hermetica describes it is almost as like the body is this kind of like bubbling cauldron filled with chemicals and noxious gases, almost, that's like bubbling, and the soul is kind of dipped in, submerged in it, you know.
Mhm.
But if you were to empty out the cauldron, so that there was no poisonous stuff in it, the cauldron's just a cauldron. It's just a
Yeah,
vessel made of elements, right? And it can be dissolved, it can be reformed, it can be
yeah.
all this kind of thing, right? So the body itself is not evil. The body itself is not bad. If anything, the body is a necessary and beautiful creation in Hermetica, because it's the vessel through which we can carry out divine will in the world, and we can bring the noetic forms closer to the earth. But the real issue for us is in the harmful negative passions that control
Mhm.
us, and they cloud the nous, right? They cloud the perception. So the real goal, I think, of the way of Hermes is not in escaping the body and planetary ascending back to the nous, right? It's ascending to remove the negative passions, and then coming
Mhm.
back into the body while you're still alive, to live a life in a body that is free from the harmful passions. And
Yeah,
when you're back in the body without the kind of the mirrors and things of the harmful passions that are destroying your life, essentially, you're free to see the world as it truly is. And when you see the world as it truly is, you see God in everything, right? So
mhm.
you see how beautiful the world truly is. Um, and as we say here, so with that in mind, we in towards the end of Corpus Hermeticum 1, we get this beautiful little section where Poimandres is telling Hermes about the different planets, and about the different passions, and the harmful passions, especially, that are ruled by those planets.
Can you
And
go into that a little bit? Can you read it and and describe each planet?
yeah, absolutely. So I'm yeah, okay, let's look at this thing. Where's my thing? Here we go. Okay. So the other thing I would say with this, real quick before we start, this sort of selection of planets and the qualities that are attributed to each planet, it's not strictly hermetic. As far as I can tell, and I'm basing this mainly on Van der Broek, her work on this. Um, as far as I can tell, the author of Corpus Hermeticum 1 is drawing these qualities of the planets per se from Vettius Valens, so his anthology. So book one of Vettius Valens' anthology. Um, the author seems to be drawing these planetary associations from balance, rather than coming up with them himself. But there are obviously some interpretations, right?
Yeah.
So it's important always to bear in mind the Hermetica is not, so the process of planetary ascent, when we're going through it, it is described as a kind of a gradual process of the ascension of awareness, essentially, where as kind of something goes up, essentially. And this is one of the tricky things that it's not exactly clear, it's not explicitly mentioned what ascends in Corpus Hermeticum 1. So like we can talk of it being the soul or the nous or something like that. And that's probably what is implied, that it is our nous, which is kind of the center of our organ of perception that kind of moves up and up and up and up. You know, that's what ascends. And then the nous eventually comes back down without the influence of the planetary spheres and without the diamonds. But it's not exactly clear what is ascending. The body certainly isn't, right? The body is often described as garments and all these kinds of things. That clearly is left behind. So the physical elements of the body, when we quote unquote, whatever we are, when that ascends, the bodily elements essentially dissolve. It's implied that as in the
and we get to our core, our divinity, whatever it is.
Our core ascends. The noetic consciousness is what ascends, essentially. The body and everything else, and also if we're using Aristotelian terminology, the animal and the plant soul, essentially, right? So the other kinds of souls that are the resulting, or are the result of the passions and all this kind of thing as well, that the daimons act on, they are dissolved, essentially, back down into their constituent elements that then eventually reform into new bodies for other nooses from the Ennead and the Ogdoad who then incarnate into, essentially. So just bear that in mind. It's not clear exactly what is ascending when we talk about Hermetica. In my opinion, it's probably nous or kind of that center, that noetic consciousness that's ascending, essentially. But other than that, it seems like it's a gradual ascent through the planetary spheres. And when you go through planetary spheres, each planet corresponds to something. So we begin with the moon. So when you first kind of are undergoing this experience and you ascend upwards, the first planet you come to, which of course is the celestial luminary, is the moon itself. And what ends up happening is the moon rules growth and decay. So the cycle of manifestation generation, I think, is the way that Copenhagen translates it. But the moon, mainly because of its cycles and its progression over time, it rules growth and decline. Right, and there is a kind of a deeper mystery to this that's mentioned in the Surveillant Hermetica, that anything that changes appearance is not true. Right, the truth, in terms of how we can define the truth is unchanging. It's stable,
exactly.
Right, so by saying the moon rules growth and decline, it's saying the moon rules changeability, so it also rules lies and illusions at the same time. And this is kind of captured in tarot as well. When you look at the moon card in tarot, in the major arcana, it means kind of dreams and illusions, and that you're not seeing a situation as it truly is, right? Which is interesting. So the moon rules growth and decay, and as it does, it rules that kind of illusionary nature. So you kind of begin to see through things. And the other kind of caveat with this is the virtue that corresponds to the planet is not something that's given to you. So all of these virtues that I'm about to mention, so the one for the moon is stability, right, or centeredness. The core mystery or the core idea of this is not that you're given this quality, it's that these qualities are what you originally had. It's the idea that this is the core of your nous, right?
And we'll kind of go through that. Like I think we should cover that right after we go through the planets once we talk about the initiations. Because I think it really ties in with that.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's an important point, right? To say you're not gaining these virtues. These are the states of being that are left once the passions are purified. So these are supposed to be your natural states, right? But through our incarnation, we have been accustomed and we've been attacked by harmful passions all the time. So it's obscured the natural vision of things. Right? So for the moon, we are under this illusion of growth and decay, right, or growth and decline. But once that is purified, once we release that back to the moon, right, once we release it back to Selene or Luna, we are left with stability. We are left with centeredness. We can see things as they truly are. right? And then we carry on upwards, right? So the next planet we come to is Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Copenhagen translates the vice of Mercury as evil, or doing
Mm-hmm.
evil means. The word he is translating in Greek, or the phrase he's translating as far as I'm aware, is kapon, which is kapon is essentially it's more like corruption than evil.
Yeah.
It's a very easy. You can translate it as evil, but evil again, it kind of implies a concept of like dualistic sin almost. That there's evil. Corruption is a bit more neutral. So I'm going to say corruption. Mercury rules corruption essentially, and corruption. I mean, in this sense, I mean in kind of the Platonic sense of like a derivation from form. Essentially, in the same way as when you copy an image, when you copy a form time and time again, it just gets more and more distorted and corrupt, right? It's not necessarily evil in the sense of like a theological sin or virtue like that, but it's corrupt in the sense that it's not the true form of things, right?
Yeah.
And that is the force or the vice that Mercury rules. And once that is released, we essentially gain a beatific vision, right? We gain goodness. So the virtue.
So with stability, goodness, we gain. Okay.
Yeah. And when that corruption from Mercury is released, we gain goodness, right? Or we regain perception of goodness. So we regain
perception of goodness.
Right. And this is kind of it's an idea that's mentioned throughout the Hermetic as well. The whole path of planetary ascent is a journey back towards the good. So you can kind of think of once we get beyond the sublunary spheres, once we get beyond the moon and into the planets proper, essentially, the first planet, the first virtue that we gain from transcending Mercury, or the virtue that we regain, is perception of the good. So all of this is kind of a journey on the road to the good. The first perception that we gain from Mercury is perception of it, so we can actually see where we're going. You know, we can actually see the good in front of us, and we're like, okay, that's where I'm heading to. That's where I need to go. You know, that's the first thing. Then, as we're moving upward, we come to Venus, right? And Venus, the vice is kind of deceptive desire. It's kind of sexual addiction, essentially. It's desire that deceives us. Now, there is a little bit of a thing here I want to talk about or touch on, because I think it's the phaedo or the phaedrus, I can't remember which, you might know, where Plato mentions this concept of eros being important in planetary ascent. Desire, the like having a genuine desire, and almost the way he describes it, because he uses the word eros, as an almost erotic desire for the good, is kind of the key driving force behind planetary ascent, because it's kind of kind of like a go-gay ritual, right? So it's an attraction. You must feel attracted to the good in order to be attracted to the good, right? So the good, by feeling that force of attraction, the good also pulls your nous to itself, essentially. So there is a positive side to desire in this sense, right? In this Venus, in this sense, the negative passion is deceptive desire. So it's desire that turns you
like desire after earthly things, the flesh,
right? Yeah. So it's
pleasure,
not necessarily material,
like the bad pleasure. I don't want to say bad, but just the pleasures that are entangled into body.
Sensation, essentially. It's
sensation.
Sensation that Plato. It's sensation in the Timaeus sense, right? It's sensation how Plato describes it in the Timaeus. Sensation that turns you away from the nous, right? Or turns you away from the good. So it's deceptive in that sense. But there is a positive kind of desire, because again, if you look at the phaedo and the phaedrus, Plato argues that eros, which is erotic desire, is needed for ascension to begin. Right? He says you need to passionately love the good in order for to be attracted to the good, and that gives you the driving power. So you need desire to actually want to go to the good, right? Yes. And that's why the virtue that you're left with when you purify Venus is a freedom from sexual addiction, right? So it's a freedom from deceptive desire. Right? You're free from kind of that deceptive way,
because that addiction is a vice.
Yes, right. Because you're and that is really what it is. Hermetic psychology is a psychology of addiction, essentially. It's addiction is the ultimate vice, right? It's too much, and this is a very Stoic concept as well, right? The key to maintaining virtue is moderation. It's very, very Stoic idea. As we live according to nature, essentially. That's kind of the Stoic principle, right? So then moving up, because again, bear in mind we're using the Chaldean or the Ptolemaic system, we come to sort of the center planet, which is the sun. right? And the sun, the vice is kind of arrogance of power, essentially. So it's the misuse of power and authority. Or I think Copenhagen translates it as like bashful authority or unreasonable.
And that makes sense
authority.
with the office of the sun.
Right, it's kingship.
Being almost like the king.
Yeah, kingship. And in some, I can't remember exactly which text. I can't remember if Plato describes it. It might be Heraclitus or something, or Hesiod. They actually describe the sun as like being the court charioteer of the solar system, and he's like carrying, or the sun has the reins of the other planets, that he's kind of like, as he's moving through, he's like carrying, like pulling the other planets along on reins, essentially, which is really fun. That's an idea. So when the sun is purified, or when the vice of the sun is purified, it leaves us with a freedom from addiction to power.
Yeah.
So it leaves us with this kind of state of being where we understand natural power, we understand natural law. So we're not addicted to gaining power because we understand true power.
Yes.
That is not the kind of power that we clutch onto, right? Which is very fun. So then we come to Mars, which is associated with brutal and reckless presumption. So assuming brutality or assuming arrogance in people, for the most part. So assumption is a good way of putting it. And rather interestingly, I'm sure there is some kind of other mystery in this, but it says that when Mars is purified, it leaves us with peace.
Yes, that makes sense.
So when we purify our assumptions, when we let go of assumptions, when we let go of reckless presumption, when we stop presuming things, we are left with peace, right? We are peaceful. And that that is a very interesting psychology trick as well.
Yeah.
Psychology you can think about, right? If you are constantly presuming things, you are living too much in the future. So when you release presumption, or when you release that kind of idea, you're left with a sense of peace, right? A lasting peace, essentially. Then we come to Jupiter, and naturally, basic astrological associations. The vice for Jupiter is a desire for wealth, right? So it's I think Copenhagen goes a bit further and says desire for wealth by evil means. And I think in general, it's just desire for wealth in general.
Yeah, like wanting more, like having things in excess or money in excess.
It's excess, essentially. That's what it is. Yeah. And the corresponding virtue that's left is freedom from greed. Right. So you don't feel that addiction, you don't feel the excess anymore. You just see things as they are, essentially, which is very fun. And then finally, the last one, when you get to Saturn, the vice is lies and deceptions.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And so naturally, when you remove lies and deceptions, which is the final gateway to the good, you are left with truthfulness and the truth, right? Which is the unchanging truth. And it's the unchanged. If you notice here, the truthfulness that you are left with after purifying Saturn is the veil that you've pierced through from the moon earlier. You know, so when you purify the moon, you gain a vision of the good through stability. And when that happens, you stop seeing things as changing, so you begin to perceive the truth because you can see things as they are, right? So the truth is, so things are no longer changing, growing, or declining. Instead, they're stable and unchanging. That's the first step to perceiving the truth. And now when we've purified Saturn, then we then see the truth in its full quality, essentially, right? Which itself is very, very interesting, right? Now, there is another aspect to the planetary ascent here. And these are, as I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about astral daimons, there are 12, what are called 12 tormentors as well. So this goes a little bit further. So this is,
and it probably goes with the zodiac too.
Yes, this is exactly the point. So in Corpus Hermeticum 13, in the purification of Asclepius, we get this very interesting section where Hermes talks about tormentors, or sort of like, you know, very, very powerful astral daimons, most of which are associated with zodiac signs. And they are essentially, these are the things that are purified during Hermetic ascent, right? So during this exorcism that Hermes performs on Asclepius, he casts out these 12 daimons, and in their place we have essentially, I think, 10. Is it 10? Let's have a look. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 10. We have 10 sort of good qualities, essentially, or virtues that are also living beings, right? So
Yeah.
and this is a very, I think this is a very important aspect to this, where these are not just concepts that we're dealing with. They're not just passive things. These are described as living beings. They are tormentors in
Hmm.
the sense that they are actually attacking us. They are
Yeah.
personified actual daimons, and they are cast out and replaced by more powerful. They're not. I wouldn't say necessarily angels in this
And
side,
yeah,
but
and even Pythagoreans like go into daimons and their existence as well. It was pretty big in the Greek world.
it's
It's
huge.
like they're just
It's huge in Hermetic
spirits.
psychology, yeah. Or Hermetic, sorry, and Hermetic astrology as well. Yeah, it's huge. It's that
Yeah.
thing. So to go through those very quickly, and we may be able to come back to these at some point. I'm not sure how much time we have. But the first temptation, or the first tormentor, I should say, is ignorance, right? Which
Hmm.
is interesting. And ignorance is cast out by a gnosis of divinity. So it's cast out by knowledge.
Hmm.
And that first, so when ignorance is cast out, it's cast out by knowledge of divinity, and it leaves you with a sense of reverence,
Yeah.
right? So and then there's also a metaphorical kind of interpretation of this, where it's like
Hmm.
ignorance is cast out by knowledge. So it being ignorant of your form is cast out by learning more about yourself. So in theory,
Yes.
reading more hermetic books. It's kind of where it's going with it, right? It's kind of like a
Hmm.
self-fulfilling prophecy. Um, that's the same thing. The next one, so the second tormentor is grief. So a sense of
Hmm.
sadness or sorrow about the state of the world, or about yourself, about your incarnation.
Yeah.
That is cast out by a joy, especially a joy of gnosis. So not
Hmm.
only having a sense of not only having a sense of knowledge and knowing about something, but actually taking pleasure in knowing, right? So actually
Hmm.
taking, like, actually loving knowledge, loving gnosis itself, taking pleasure in knowing and being with God, right? So feeling that joy of being on the journey is what casts out the grief as well, right? So
Hmm.
the grief is a tormentor that hurts you, but having a genuine joy for divinity and a genuine reverence, which is the in Greek iosobia or eusorbia,
Hmm.
casts out that daimon, right? And it brings in that spirit of joy to you. This idea was even picked up by some early Christian writers, and I remember you telling me this. It's like in some like early Christian stuff, sin is described almost as a living thing that like comes at you and
Yeah,
attacks
in the book
onto
of
you.
John.
Yeah,
Quite literally in the book of John.
right. And this is, and I also found this out recently. A side note, very interesting. One of the things that like, and this was like a really big thing in like alchemy in like the 16th, 17th century as well, where
Hmm.
like with science experiments, one of the main dangers to yourself from performing occult experiments or science experiments was believed, especially around the 16th, 17th century, was that you could bring your sin into the operation, right? So if you were performing
Hmm.
alchemy, or you were performing an invocation or whatever it was, like the entire point of performing the penitential psalms, right, or the entire
Hmm.
point of doing the purifications before you do the operation, is because there was a risk that you were bringing your sin into ritual. And it's not just metaphorical. There is an ontological
Hmm.
reason for this, right? There is this idea that sin is itself a personified entity, that is something that is
Hmm.
attached to you, right? And it's clawing its way at you. And if you bring that into ritual, it dilutes the experiment, right? It knocks the experiment off in some way. So that's why the penitential psalms are so important, because you need to purify that creature that's kind of latched onto your back, essentially. You know, and
Hmm.
we've kind of lost that idea in modern science, where like when you're performing science, your own sin can, again, it's very hermetic almost, where it's like the physical entity behind that is coming on, and it can skew your perception, right?
Hmm.
And going back to yesterday when we had our podcast, when we were talking about this, how some people who are into the occult community, when they're very early on, they will take anything as an evidence that their thing is working, right? They'll go for anything. They'll
Hmm.
feel like a slightest touch and say, oh, it's working. Like in the medieval mind, that could be conceptualized as them, like their own quote unquote sin getting in the way, because it's
Hmm.
deceiving them in understanding the true gnosis, because they
Yeah.
aren't going through the purification, they aren't going through these long drawn out things. And that it skews your perception because you're seeing the world through that thing until it's purified, essentially, right? And this is kind of the idea with hermetism, but that's the same thing. So going back to this, number 3, so the third tormentor is intemperance, so sort of recklessness and kind of, instability almost.
Yeah.
And very funny, very, very interestingly for me, that is cast out by what's the Greek? So like self-control, basically, moderation. It's very, very stoic, right? Very interesting. Lust is the next one. So like very Venusian, right?
Is that the 7th or the 8th?
This is number 4.
Okay, number 4. Okay.
Yeah. It's number 4, and that is cast out by perseverance.
Interesting,
right?
for the number 4 for that zodiac. That's interesting.
Yeah, so for lust. Because what is 4th planet? It's Jupiter, isn't it? Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we going through the zodiac?
I mean, it's implied that it's the
Okay,
zodiac.
it's implied. Okay.
It's not. There's no like official definition that says these are
Okay.
the zodiac. But the fact that there's 12 probably implies that it is. But yeah.
Okay.
But we also we're not sure exactly on the order as well, which is its own thing.
Yeah.
But we just know there are 12 tormentors. But
Okay.
yeah, lust is cast out by perseverance, which you still kind of, we get an air of it in even some modern contemplative Christian movements where they say, if the flesh is weak and you're feeling lustful, pray for perseverance. This kind of carries forth that idea, which is very interesting. Number 5 is injustice, and that's obviously cast out by justice, right? So the antithetical Jupiter is cast out by the healthy Jupiter, essentially. Very interesting. Greed is cast out by generous sharing, so abundance, essentially, so sharing your abundance with the world. Deceit is cast out by truth, which is very interesting. And then was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? The last sort of the 5, or the next 5, are an interesting one, because the next 5 are actually all cast out by 3 powers. So the next 5, if I go through them quickly, that they are envy, which is number 8, treachery, which is number 9, anger, number 10, recklessness, number 11, and then corruption is number 12. And all of those are cast out by what in Greek is identified as zoe, phos, and poagathon. So life, light, and good. And the life, the light, and the good are the way the one is described, right? So the monad. So
and you could tell that this is late antiquity, because this is also described like in the Bible as well. And this seemed to be a big thing, especially during these philosophical schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of that's the progression, that's the pathway that you go through, right? And when you get to that sort of, I guess, around the 8th tormentor, right? So around envy, that's when, because this is a successive thing. So like the exorcism is in 2 parts. What Hermes is doing to Asclepius, right? He's not only exercising these daimons, which are personifications of these things, but he's also invoking these good qualities. So he's like, he's kind of conceptualized as angels and demons, but these things are not really angels in the sense. They may be similar to like aeons in Gnosticism. Maybe you could conceptualize it like that.
Or it could be something like what Iamblichus said. And you have the opinion he was a hermeticist?
I mean, he cites basically, like in the opening of the Mysterious, he cites Hermes as his source for everything. So I'm fairly convinced he's a hermeticist. Yeah.
So, and he brought up the idea that the angels are actually gods.
Yeah. So
he didn't. Yeah, and he didn't deny like the existence of angels or anything, but just saw them as different kinds of gods, like just beings. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
A higher power.
Yeah, so it could also be that, absolutely, that's another thing. But the core idea is that Hermes, as well as exercising these harmful passions or these harmful daimons, he is invoking these successively as well. So he's invoking these good qualities one by one, and the way he actually describes it is like the daimon gives way to the good one, right? So the evil qualities give way to the positive one, and they fill you. They fill you up,
and they fill your spirit.
Then towards the end of Corpus Hermeticum 13, we have a very, very powerful hymn called the Secret Hymn, or the Hymn of the Hidden Stele, I think it's called,
Mm-hmm.
where basically it's like an invocation, basically, where
Mm-hmm.
the initiate who essentially has undergone this process, they will sing this hymn, and you actually then speak to these qualities inside of you. You say, look, I speak to the gnosis of divinity inside of me. You are singing a hymn to the one, right? I speak to joy, who is after gnosis. You are
Yeah.
singing a hymn to the one. You are singing a hymn, whatever it is. And I think he actually recommends as well. He's like, you need, like, I mean, there is a sense of hermetic
And
ritual.
it's almost like as if the evil is alive, or sin is alive, the good is equally alive. And
Yes,
that's what this
exactly.
is.
And you're invoking that quality into
Yeah.
yourself, and then with the
And you're
hymn,
singing to it.
you're singing to it. You're project like, so
Yeah.
like it's inside of you, but you're waking it up inside of you, and you're giving it
Yes.
back to the one as well,
Yeah.
right? So the one has bestowed these gifts on you, and you awaken them within yourself, and then through the hymn of the hidden stele, you give it back to the one. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that all of these things, they bring you closer to the one, right? So they are
Yeah.
pivotal in Planetary Ascent, because you're singing them, and as the forces in you, so right, so as the truth, the life, the light, the good, as they are singing in you, again, think Pythagoras, the resonance, the musical
Mm-hmm.
spheres, as it's singing in the musica humana, it resonates in the musica universalis.
Yeah.
Right? And again, then following Plato with that erotic desire,
Yeah.
that resonance, everything kind of fits together. By singing to it, the resonance then draws you closer to it, because like in the
Mm-hmm.
same way when you pluck a guitar string, right? Another one
Yeah.
plucks, it resonates the same kind of thing. They both vibrate. You're vibrating at certain tones. And I don't mean that in the new agey way. I mean you're
Yeah.
physically
Yeah. I know what
vibrating,
you mean. Yeah.
right? So in the sense of you're singing at certain tones, because in the same way you have a voice box. So different planets have different notes to them. And
And
this
we're
is what
talking
you
about
also,
music in a divine way, like it wasn't
yes.
separate.
No. The vocalizations you can make are the abstract qualities of the planets themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So when you do them, when you sing them, when you vibrate them, you are corresponding, you are resonating with that planet. And each of these obviously also has a planetary quality to it as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And even
so you
Agrippa
sing it.
goes into the different voices and
Yeah,
how they're each are assigned to a planet.
yeah, exactly. And the idea is that when you sing this, the planets respond to you, or the daimons,
Mm-hmm.
and the good daimons, and the one and the angels, whatever, they respond to you and they pull you upwards, right? And
Yeah.
this is kind of what we see in the discourse of the eighth and ninth, right? So the Ogdoad and the Ennead in Nag Hammadi, where he's giving that string of Hermetic names, right? So Zoxa Thazos,
Mm-hmm.
then the vowel sounds. They're not just chanted at random. Each note has to be chanted at a specific tone and a certain,
Mm-hmm.
or each vowel is chanted at a specific note and tone and frequency.
And we
Uh,
see this translated in a PGM the same way for a magical formula.
yeah, it's a really common idea. And in fact, the PGM even calls the vowel sounds the great sevenfold name as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually identifies it as a name in and of itself, and it's the name of the universe itself, right? The first seven
Mm-hmm.
letters that come into creation, that is the
And
name
it's
of the
totally
universe.
opposite from Hebrew that has no vowels,
Yeah,
which is ironic because it's believed that that the Greek and Hebrew came from the same people.
mm,
You
yeah.
know,
So it's weird because like, if you think of if you, even on a very syntax morphology level, if you think about what a vowel
mm-hmm.
is, it's the core of a word, right? The vowel is the center of the word that you
Yeah,
attach consonants to. So it's the same thing. The vowel, when you're speaking it, the vowel is the center of the universe. It's the
and we have
creator
the
of the
seven
universe.
planets
Yeah.
tied
It's
to that
all
too.
that. And again, if you think of it like the way, and I think Iamblichus mentions this, where he kind of conceptualizes it in a similar way, where you know the vowels and the planets are symbols of each other, right?
Yes.
So like the vowels are like the lower octave of the planets, so that when you're
Mm-hmm.
speaking them and you're singing them, you are actually you are connecting to the planets themselves, because the vowel sounds that are vocalized are actually the planets themselves. They're just a lower octave
Yeah,
of them. That's kind of how he conceptualizes it. Which is it's incredible to think about, and
it's
there are so
amazing.
many there are so many things you can do with that. Like if I was to get very practical for a moment, I often do this, or I incorporate this to when I'm doing planetary or astrological talismans as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm making a talisman for a certain planet, I'll go and find the corresponding note as well,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll vibrate that note, like while I'm carving the planetary square on it, or the
Mm-hmm.
seal of the intelligence, right? I'll vibrate that note into the incense. Or one of the things that I had some pretty good results with it, which were really, really interesting,
Mm-hmm.
is I will use my voice to mimic the planetary descent of a spirit
Mm-hmm.
coming down. So say I'm making a sun talisman, for example, and I'm
Yeah.
invoking Nakiel, which is the intelligence of the sun, right? What I'll do, I'll get my material, my solar stone, or my bit of gold, or whatever, or
Mm-hmm.
my brass plate, whatever it is, my bronze plate that I'm carving on, and when I've sort of done the general invocation, one of the things I'll do is I'll sort of hold the brass plate, whatever, at the top of the incense smoke, and I'll like
Mm-hmm.
gradually lower it through the incense smoke as I'm chanting the different vowel sounds to
Mm-hmm.
emulate
Oh, the
idea
descent.
of the noose of descending through
Yeah.
planetary spheres, right? And I'll speak it out. And I've had some really interesting results with that, which
I'm
has
gonna
been
have to
very
try
fun.
that. That's cool.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
So, let and it's interesting. I think we can cover two more things. I know it's getting late over there, getting late over
Mm.
here. We haven't even dived into all of Hermeticism or Hermes. I think we should save that for another episode. But um, and we can go even more into Hermeticism here. Uh, so I think covering at least one more topic should be good, and that would be initiation. And I
Mm.
think we can put this kind of briefly. When we look at the eighth and ninth discourse, we see uh with the in the eighth sphere, which
Mhm.
we see the souls, and in the ninth, we see that it's listed that the angels are singing. And oddly enough, we find this in the Nag Hammadi,
Yeah.
and this is one of the few texts that describes uh Hermes, that mentions the names Hermes, more or
Mm.
less, right?
Yeah.
So
Directly.
and this brings us to initiation, and that is a kind of initiation, right? And so let's go into Hermetic initiation to talk about the ascent, and I think we should be all right, and we can schedule another episode.
Yeah.
How's that
Absolutely.
sound?
So, yeah. So the first thing to kind of understand when it comes to something like with looking at the discourse for the eighth and ninth, um, is the discourse of the eighth and ninth is very clearly a late stage text, right? So to put it into context, when you look at the Corpus Hermeticum, we have a bit of an issue in that they actually, like, the version of Corpus Hermeticum that we have with its numbered treaties, or all of the treaties that we have in the numbered order that we have them, that didn't actually exist in antiquity, right? They are, for the most part, completely unrelated treaties. The numbering system is Byzantine and Renaissance. It's not actually applied to the Hermetica in general. You could take all of the numbers out. So when we talk about Corpus Hermeticum 1, 13, 12, whatever, you
Yeah.
could take the numbers away entirely and it would make no difference to the system. The numbers are not important whatsoever. They are not in any logical order. In fact, I think I've seen Christian Bull and Van der Kershove argue that there are even there are some treaties in Corpus Hermetica in the Corpus Hermeticum that are not Hermetic at all, that they don't have any Hermetic content in them, or anything that is distinctly Hermetic. So, or even when we read the Corpus Hermeticum, there are some sections in there that are not Hermetic. They don't contain any
Mhm.
actual Hermetic theology. They were just collated because they were similar
Yeah.
or someone thought it was Hermetic, but there's actually no Hermetic idea in it. Um, but that's a whole other thing. But there does seem to be this idea of a progression. Like we call this kind of the way of Hermes. And I think Foden is the first to really coin this term, the way of Hermes, essentially.
It's
Uh,
beautiful too.
it's a bit. I really enjoy it. Actually, it's probably going to be also why I'm doing a course on Hermetica probably in January or February. I'm probably going to call it the way
Mhm.
of Hermes. It's a really nice name. But the basic idea, when you look at the way of Hermes, when we are reading the text, there does seem to be this idea that you read text in a certain order,
Yeah.
right? There is a certain order that you read the text to, and in doing so, they reveal deeper and deeper mysteries as you, I don't know, essentially you read them in a certain order and certain things are unlocked, right? Now, of course, we
Okay,
don't
so
know
let
the
so
order.
let's kind of pause right here. To conceptualize this a little bit. So we're talking about kind of a philosophical school in a sense, right?
Yes.
So when we're talking about the planetary ascent, like with the vices that come with each thing, it's like a preparation for the soul. And each
Yes.
of these initiations we would read, like let's say it was me and you would read those to me, and I
Mhm.
would take in that lesson and I would actualize that in my life, apply
Yes.
it, live it, and there would probably be some sort of trial or test. And a
There will
big
probably be
part,
some kind of initiation ritual for
yeah.
that, that
And
area.
you
Yeah.
would have me sing it to make sure I know the notes,
Yeah.
and we would use that as a hymn to kind of get in touch with that virtue and to kind of cleanse the soul potentially.
Mm.
I don't know,
Or in the very
maybe
least,
stop.
it would cleanse the soul of that particular
Yeah,
passion that was plaguing you
of
at,
that
at that
passion.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, so we would use that note to cleanse the soul of that passion,
Mhm.
and we would go to the next text, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so yes, essentially, that like, and this is like it has been a bit controversial, but since the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in 1945, a lot of the modern Hermetica scholars, we are fairly convinced now that there probably was a Hermetic community in late
Mhm.
antiquity. People like the early scholars, so Nock and Fusilier, for example, who are some of the earliest scholars on Hermetica, they were very fervently convinced that Hermetica was just a literary tradition,
Yeah.
that there was nobody in history that was ever actually practicing Hermetica. The Hermetica existed only in books, essentially.
Mhm.
But since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, we have obviously the Dictator Thing for Ninth. We also have the Prayer of Thanksgiving, which mentions explicitly ritual gestures and seems to imply at the end, there's a little section at the end of the Prayer of Thanksgiving that says, and they sung this hymn and then they embraced, which one implies that there was some kind of ritual gesture or ritual
Yeah.
embrace, whether it was a kiss or it was a hug or a handshake, or we don't know what it
Mhm.
is. Um, and then it says, and then they went to enjoy a meal together, like a feast of bloodless food, right? So vegetarian
Mhm.
food, which is Pythagorean, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So it implies that there were communal feasts in
Yeah.
Hermetica as well, right? And that very clearly, like, denotes the idea that there is a community here, right? So it
Mhm.
does seem that there is a lived practice that's going on here. As far as we can tell, there doesn't seem it was not a big thing. There was no
And it
in the
was
same way
probably
that
localized in
yeah.
different groups that were
Yeah, so
scattered.
as far as we can tell, there was no authoritative position, there was no church, there was no big thing. This was not a large
Mhm.
scale thing. If we're going by Zosimos and Theosorbia, so his female student, and both of those are also considered, or I know that the Hanegraaff considers Zosimos and
Mhm.
Theosorbia Hermeticists as well. The Zosimos especially mentions Poimandres. And he actually says one of his pieces of advice to Thesorbia is that she should race back to Poimandres in her work. So he's probably a Hermeticist, or at the very least, he is familiar enough with the Hermetica, or at least Corpus Hermeticum 1 to the
Mhm.
Poimandres to quote it. That's as far as we know. So he must have
Yeah.
played. Um, but the way him and Thesorbia kind of communicate, the way they talk about things, it implies that they're kind of beating at each other's houses for rituals.
Yeah.
So it's not that there's this big temple. It's not that there's this big
Yes.
kind of thing.
Yeah, it was like probably a small group of students and
Yeah,
teachers
yeah,
that would meet up in places,
yeah.
their own
Probably over at someone's
homes,
house, or they would meet up in the
and
back room of an academy somewhere, in Athens or whatever,
and
or
and
something.
and they would probably take hallucinogens or something
There
like
was probably
that,
some kind of psychedelic involved.
and
Absolutely.
they
Yeah,
would sing and praise kind of like we see in the Hermetica,
yeah,
and they would use that as kind of as an experience for visions.
yeah.
And
Essentially,
it's
yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
Plato talks about that experience a little bit with wine too.
Yeah, well, so the thing with wine, or like, because again, wine is the primary sacrament for the Dionysian mysteries, right? But the way they can so for one, Greek
Mhm.
wine, like ancient Greek wine, was like incredibly watered down. Like compared to our wine, like if you can't really compare ancient Greek wine to modern wine because they're very different, right? The processing for the fermentation is very different. If you drunk neat ancient Greek wine, you would get drunk, like incapacitated very, very fast, right? Unless it was watered down. So it's very, very different to modern wine. Um, But the Dionysians were kind of weird in the sense that they considered that drunken state a state of mania, which is or it was this kind of, it was conceptualized as a freedom from societal taboos, essentially. And what's really interesting with it is usually they most likely would have laced their wine with some kind of hallucinogen.
Oh yeah, probably some opium or something.
It's opium, or the other one that it was known to have been used in the Eleusinian mysteries was ergot fungus, so, which is the same chemical that Albert Hoffman derived LSD from, right? Which is also very interesting.
And isn't it speculated that Demeter is holding the opium plant?
It's opium, or it's a shaft of wheat, right? And the
Okay.
thing with it is that ergot fungus is a rot that grows on wheat,
Yeah.
essentially, and it's psychedelic when you eat it, right? So it's either a shaft of wheat or an opium. Yeah, we don't need to be. It's not entirely clear which. But the idea with the Dionysians is that they would drink the wine, and in theory, that state of mania and drunkenness that you experience when you drink wine is actually Dionysus possessing you.
So in a sense, an initiation was a very serious kind of party when we
It's
look at the mysteries.
Yeah,
Like it's where you would
essentially.
have it's like you'd be hyper focused, but you'd be sitting there kind of in your zone. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
yeah.
Like I always joke that if we saw Plato or if we saw Pythagoras or these people today, we would call these people stoners.
Absolutely, or drunks in the very least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often like to conceptualize, especially the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Because bear in mind, I think one of the things that people often forget with the mysteries is that the mysteries were oftentimes a communal event, right?
Yes.
It was an entire processual thing. We have this kind of romanticized vision that is largely from the Victorian era, that it was like a one-on-one initiation, that like a secret priest somewhere, the
Yeah.
hierophant, would take you into like a back closet room and show you the arcane secrets, and then you would be initiated into the god. It's like, I'm sure that happened in some private scenarios, I'm not
Yeah.
gonna lie, but for the most part, we have some records from Athens record almost 2,000 people showing up to a mystery initiation
Was
at
it
any,
the
at any one point.
Eleusinian mysteries? Because
Yeah,
those are the most popular. They were
yeah,
like just
yeah.
as I don't want to say they were as big as Christianity, but they were pretty big
They
around
were
the
pretty
place.
big. They were known throughout.
Yeah.
And even as late as Michael Psellus, right? So the Byzantine monk who was also associated with Hermetica. We have records of Psellus in some of his manuscripts saying that initiations are still going on in Athens, even in his time. And that's medieval Byzantine time as well.
Yeah.
Whether that was like the same kind of initiation,
Yeah.
we don't know, probably obviously not, but he says that Athens, at the very least, or in the very least, sacred plains of Demeter, which is where Eleusis was located, there
There's
was
like just
still an
something
idea of
existed.
initiation. There was some kind of initiation reputation that was persisting even into the middle medieval period there as well, which is really interesting. But like if you like zoom out and then sort of conceptualize what it probably looked like at any given moment, right? Imagine a room filled with 100, 200 people, all pitch black in the darkness, right? All probably stoned or drunk, just like sitting in their own little area, right? And
Yeah.
then suddenly someone turns on the lights, or suddenly someone turns on the flame, and there's this massive luminous epiphany, and you have 200 people just get absolutely black out, like they freak out, and you have an
Yeah.
entire room, right? It's kind of weird and crazy and funny to picture. To me, like
Mhm.
I sit down and I try and picture like 200 people just raving
Oh
drunk,
my.
essentially in a room in darkness, and someone turns on the light, and they're all like, you know, but
And then it turns in like the hymns and celebrations,
right, and then
and
there's a
then
procession, and there's always this thing, yeah.
yeah.
So it's a whole thing, yeah. And coming back to Hermetica, so a similar kind of thing would have happened just on a much smaller
Mhm.
scale, right? So it would have been probably in some, they may have gone over to each other's houses. There may have been small
Mhm.
circles of things that was going on, and then yes, they would have sort of gone through that progression essentially, right? But
Mhm.
what's really interesting with this whole thing is there is actually there's another part to it, really, and it's the in-person part of it. So there is this idea, it's preserved in Sufism
Mhm.
for the most part, and it's this idea that there is a kind of, what is that? Is that me or you? Let's go. That's just like weird notification sound. There you go. There's
Okay.
this idea in Sufism, and I think it is preserved in Sufism, where there is a kind of exchange of consciousness, exchange of energy and nous that happens between master and student. So it's not just you're not just reading the texts, right? So in Hermetic, and most likely this is happening for Hermetica too. When you are sitting in a room being read these texts too, right? So your master or your teacher is reading these texts and these concepts or these aphorisms to you. Uh,
Mhm.
you're not just reading them. Somebody, the master who in theory has attained gnosis, right, is reading the text to you. And there is an idea, we see hints of it in Corpus Hermeticum
Mhm.
13, where Hermes deliberately deludes Asclepius to break his
Yeah.
mind, right? He keeps saying deliberately polarizing things that make no sense
Mhm.
until Asclepius breaks his rational mind, breaks down, can't handle it. And that's the
Mhm.
point when the exorcism begins, right? So there's this idea that there is some kind of energy or attunement in the
Mhm.
words of the master and the speaker themselves that is transferred to the student in person.
And could it have been, like, chanted?
Well, it's not even just chanted. It's the word itself. So if you imagine somebody reading from the Corpus Hermeticum,
Mhm.
right? So you read a philosophical treatise,
Yeah.
there seems to be some hints of this idea that there is an exchange of energy that happens when you as the
Mhm.
student are sitting and listening, and the master or the teacher is projecting and reading the treatise to you, that
Yeah.
not only are you listening to the words, the logos in you, which again, if we remember, is
Mhm.
defined in Corpus Hermeticum 1 as that in you which sees and hears, right?
Yeah.
There is this idea that if you perceive with the heart, right, and again in Egyptian, the heart, the ib,
Mhm.
is the organ of true perception. The heart is the means of perceiving with the nous, essentially,
Mhm.
right? If your heart can perceive the truth of what is being read to you and being said by the master or the teacher, there
Yeah.
is some like the attunement that
Mhm.
happens by them reading it to you. So
Yeah.
even before the ritual, even before the chanting, before anything's going on, being in the presence of somebody who has attained gnosis and having them read to you, there is a transference of energy that begins the
Yeah.
process, and that's something we're missing because obviously we can't be in person, right? So we're
And
missing
we
that.
kinda see that example, like, in the 8th and 9th discourse, especially in the 8th with the souls, like,
Yeah,
those were the initiated, but,
right.
I tell you what, I think we should have a 3rd one because
Mhm.
we covered so much territory, we didn't even go into, like, the Egyptian aspects of this fully, we talked a lot about the Hellenism.
Yeah,
I mean, we could go on for a
we can
lot
go on for
longer,
hours, but it's getting on to
but
midnight for me. Yeah, of
but yeah, I wanna thank you for being here.
course.
I deeply appreciate it, buddy. Like oh my goodness, this is a really good two-part series. And that's why I broke this down was
Yeah,
because it's a lot to take in for both sides, you know?
yeah,
Like when I make a long video like this, a lot of times I don't realize what I'm saying. Like if
yeah,
I make a 2-hour long video,
yeah.
I have to break it down and digest it myself. So I appreciate your expertise and your knowledge. Like this is so helpful
Absolutely.
into bringing some more context. And we'll get a third show on the way sometime, and we'll probably try to get it out in December or something
Yeah,
because I know
absolutely.
we both have a lot of projects and stuff going on.
Yeah, for sure we can find time for it.
Yep. So, once again, thank you. And thank you for listening and watching. So please like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought about this. We'd love to hear it. And we hope you learned something and you can take it with you and maybe perception has changed. Let us know. And all of you have a great day in 18.